Well, good afternoon. I can't tell you how good it is to see you all here in the room. It's been far too long. Welcome to our guests, the old stalwarts here at the Little Lecture Series, and welcome to our first speakers for the 2022 Little Lecture Series at the West Virginia Humanities Council. Bear with me while I go through the boilerplate stuff. It's been a couple of years. You may have forgotten. We are the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is our primary institutional partner. Although the council is not a state agency, we present original humanities programming in part through a grant from the state of West Virginia, as well as through contributions from the public, thank you very much, and some support from foundations and sister organizations. The Little Lecture Series is, and has been for many years, one of the council's most popular legacy programs. One Sunday afternoon a month into the spring, historically from March through June, the council hosts a distinguished speaker, or in this case, speakers, for an intimate presentation and conversation centered on history, literature, archaeology, music, folk life, or any of the other areas of the humanities. This year's series is, as far as we know, our first themed series in the council's history, presented under the heading A More Perfect Union. And this series is made possible through direct funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities through their initiative of the same title. Each of the 5 talks, we're adding a 5th one this year, each of the 5 talks in our 2022 Little Lecture Series will focus on issues relating to civics history and education, civic engagement, and the democratic process. A timely topic to be sure. So let's get into it. Confidence in the election process has, how would one say, declined, taken a few hits in the recent years in the United States. So how do we begin to restore it? This little lecture builds on an effort to engage the public in a discussion about elections outside of a partisan context. Grounded in real examples from West Virginia and all over the globe, it emphasizes how the rules we use reflect underlying values and how society's choices often require trade-offs among competing values. Erik Herron is the Eberly Family Distinguished Professor of Political Science at WVU. He has researched elections all over the world for 2 decades and has published several articles and books related to electoral systems. Paige Wantlin is a graduate student in the Public Administration program at WVU. In addition to her research on elections, she has assessed government responses to the pandemic in Ukraine and brownfields reclamation in West Virginia. Erik and Paige have been collaborating on a project related to elections in West Virginia since 2020. Their joint presentation this afternoon is titled Election Integrity and Processes, West Virginia's Contributions to a More Perfect Union. Please welcome Erik and Paige.
So thank you all for coming this afternoon. We'd like to thank the West Virginia Humanities Council for inviting us. We're really pleased to have the opportunity to launch this season of the Little Lectures. And I'd like to begin with a quotation from one of the most famous studies of American politics ever written. Here, the author describes election campaigns. As the election draws near, of the activity of intrigue and the agitation of the populace increase, the citizens are divided into hostile camps, each of which assumes the name of its favorite candidate. The whole nation glows with feverish excitement. The election is the daily theme of the press, the subject of private conversation, the end of every thought and every action, the sole interest of the present. It is true that as soon as the choice is determined, this ardor is dispelled, calm returns, and the river, which had nearly broken its banks, sinks to its usual level. But who can refrain from astonishment that such a storm should have arisen? Now, many of the observations of Alexis de Tocqueville, the French scholar who wrote the 19th century classic, Democracy in America, which is the source of this quote, have remained remarkably accurate. Even this characterization of U.S. politics might have gone unchallenged until recently. But in the 2020 election cycle, calm did not return, and the activities and agitation of the American people that Tocqueville characterizes as a river actually broke its banks and has not yet sunk to its usual level. Early this year, a poll indicated that 64% of Americans felt that U.S. democracy was in crisis. 35% of Americans did not accept the results of the 2020 election, with a significant partisan divide. A higher proportion of Republicans did not believe that the election was legitimate. In an earlier poll in West Virginia, held in September 2021, 43% believed that the results of the election were due to fraud, and 14% were not sure. The Election Data and Science Lab at MIT studied the question of election confidence all over the country and in West Virginia, and found that in West Virginia, 87% of Republicans and 97% of Democrats were confident that state elections were counted accurately. So the researchers concluded that in general, people were confident that their personal vote was counted accurately, but were less confident in the tabulation of votes as the process moved from the local to the national level. So people were less confident in the results of the process nationally, even though they were confident that their personal vote was counted accurately. Now, whether or not you think this is a crisis for the country, discussions about elections have continued, and many states have changed their election rules in response to a wide range of concerns about the most recent election cycles. In the debate about election reforms, proposals made by Democrats are often criticized as overreach of federal authority or dangerous efforts that make fraud easier to commit. Proposals made by Republicans are often criticized as efforts to suppress voters. What we often fail to do in our discussions about elections is separate our preferences for partisan outcomes from the underlying values and priorities that we might want to see reflected in our election processes. So what do I mean by values and priorities? Philosophers have thought more carefully and described more eloquently what we mean by values and what we mean by priorities. For our purposes today, the definition is pretty straightforward. When we think about our values and priorities, especially for elections, we're establishing what we think ought to be. So what do I mean by ought to be? As an example, you and I might prefer that the truth is what we experience in our personal and our professional lives, hearing the truth from others and conveying the truth ourselves. To achieve the truth, we might embrace values like honesty or loyalty in our own lives, in our families, in our workplaces. Values of honesty and loyalty can be connected to a priority for straight talk. We want people to tell us the unvarnished truth. By values and priorities in elections, I don't mean that my candidate or your candidate wins. In elections, there are winners and losers. All of us here have probably supported candidates who've been victorious, and all of us have probably supported candidates who have failed. It's a natural part of the process. We don't feel good about losing, but typically we move on to fight another day. The values and priorities we want to associate with elections are not about the outcomes. They're about the process. All of us can probably remember an experience from our childhood when we were upset by failure, whether that was playing a board game or a sport or getting a bad grade on a test. Failure never feels good. Looking back on our failure, we might recognize that we made a bad move or a bad pass in a game or didn't study enough for a test. And that disappointment, the disappointment that comes with those kinds of failures, usually doesn't linger. We learn from our failures, change our behaviors, maybe win the next time. When we feel that our failure wasn't due to some shortcoming on our part, but unfair rules or an unequal application of the rules, the bad feelings can linger. And these are often the events that we remember because we think the outcome was produced by an unjust process. We couldn't win because the rules were stacked against us. Now, I've studied elections for decades, and one thing I can certainly conclude about them is no set of election rules is perfect. No set of election rules will make everyone happy. But every choice we make about how we cast votes and how we count them is based on some underlying principle of what is fair or what we believe is fair. So instead of thinking about elections from the perspective of what makes our side win, we'd benefit from thinking about what would make rules fair and just So the winners and losers are determined by legitimate competition. Now, Paige and I have been talking to a wide range of people since the 2020 elections in an effort to have this kind of conversation. And our talk today is based on some of the work we've done to spark a discussion of common values we can agree on about what make elections fair. So we've spoken at length with former Secretary of State Natalie Tennant, with Secretary of State Mac Warner and his staff, and with county-level election officials all across the state. And we have several goals. We hope that having these conversations and involving the public can help restore some of the lost confidence in American elections that we've all witnessed. We also hope that these conversations can help guide policymaking. And by sharing our thoughts with you here today, you're now a part of this conversation as well. So let's return to this question of values and priorities. We want to think about principles of fair play. And these principles are not only supposed to form the foundation of our education process, the foundation of our economic system, the foundation of our athletic competitions, but also our elections. So let's think about values that we connect with elections. And we can begin with how the international community defines elections. Now, I've worked as an international election observer in 15 different elections, and I've seen credible elections and I've witnessed fraud. When the power went out in the middle of the night during the vote count in a polling place in the Republic of Georgia, I witnessed how members of the commission and observers like myself pulled out our flashlights to help the poll officials count the ballots and make sure every vote counted. I've navigated security roadblocks on the way to polling places in Ukraine after Russia first invaded Ukrainian territory in 2014. And in all of these cases, people worked diligently to ensure that everyone's vote counted. I've also witnessed fraud. I've witnessed groups of voters being paid, forged voter registries, efforts to stuff ballot boxes. Now, the baseline set of principles for democratic elections is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The U.S. is a signatory, all UN members are signatories. And it says that everyone has the right to take part in the government of their country, directly or through freely chosen representatives. It also says that the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government, and that this will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be held by universal and equal suffrage, and also shall be held by secret ballot or the equivalent free voting procedures. So let's look at these statements more closely. Governments should include the people's participation directly or through freely chosen representatives. And if we couple this with the call for universal suffrage, this statement is associated with important values of access and inclusion. Elections, as a human right, call for us to make sure that people can participate. While it doesn't mean that there can be no limitations, and we'll talk about some limitations a bit later, it privileges a process that includes rather than excludes. So when we think about access, we're focused on the idea of ensuring that people who have the right to vote also have the ability to register, to gather the information they need to cast a meaningful vote, and to successfully cast their ballot. When we think about inclusion, we're also thinking about populations who might have been historically prevented from participation and ways to make sure that they're welcome in the process. So this could include women, underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, people with limited education or literacy, people with disabilities, and other populations that have not been traditionally well represented. And we should also think carefully about what we mean by representation. The values of access and inclusion lead us to think about how we could deal with different priorities for representation. So sometimes we might think of representation in a geographic sense. So there's a person elected to an assembly who comes from where I live. And because they come from where I live, they understand the needs of people like me and can convey my preferences in the policy-making process. That's one way we can think of representation. Another way is in a symbolic sense. There's a person elected to the assembly who looks like me, maybe in terms of gender identification, race or ethnicity, life experience, or some other personal feature. And because that person looks like me, they may be better able to convey my preferences. A third way we can think of representation is in a partisan sense. So there's a person elected who shares my views, and that's reflected in their party identification. And because that person thinks like me, they may be better able to convey my preferences. Now, we might think of representation as a combination of these features, or we might think one is more important at different times. It's important to acknowledge that we don't have a consensus here in West Virginia or across the country about which approach to representation is the most important. Now, another part of the Universal Declaration, the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This means that citizens should be able to hold officials accountable. We should be able to see what our government's doing, evaluate what they're doing, and if they're not fulfilling their promises, we should be able to replace public officials. So accountability is a priority that we should associate with elections. And for elections to accomplish this, to achieve accountability, they need to be conducted with integrity. We need to make sure the true preferences of voters are reflected in the outcomes. So we have a process that protects the security and privacy of the vote, and it means that the process accurately translates individual preferences into the outcomes. So integrity means that the process has some safeguards against fraud or malpractice. So fraud's the intentional effort to cheat. It could be stuffing the ballot box, intimidating your opponents or their supporters, and so on. Malpractice is an error in the process, like a mistake in the counting process. It's not malicious, it's not intentional, but it can affect what the outcome is. Let me just make a brief comment on fraud. In every election, we hear stories about fraud, and there is fraud in every large election. But in the US, fraud that is systematic, widespread, or decisive is incredibly rare. But to restore confidence in elections, we have to think about how we enhance integrity and enhance voter trust. That only those eligible to vote cast ballots, that the process is translating the vote count accurately, and that we're getting the correct result. So far, we've had a few priorities and values to think about. Access, inclusion, integrity, along with accountability and representation. And there are others we could talk about. We could talk about proportionality, but we're going to stop here. Finding balance among these competing priorities or values, it's not easy. And what works for some communities well may not work for other communities. Now, as a country, we've found balance in these kinds of values in different ways at different times. The image on our presentation slides is an etching of a painting that is an original work by George Caleb Bingham. It's owned by the National Gallery of Art. And it depicts a local election held in Missouri in the mid-19th century. So let's explore this image for a moment and the kinds of values and priorities it presents to us. So early American elections were rowdy. Candidates and their allies served liquor. Voters and party activists would get in fistfights. And you can see this in the painting. The gentleman in the lower left is enjoying a drink. It's either as a reward for his vote or maybe some encouragement to vote for a particular candidate. The gentleman in the bottom right, slumped over, disheveled with a bandana on his head, is either nursing wounds from an altercation, inebriated, maybe both. If you look toward the focal point of the painting, just to the right of center, you can see a man announcing his vote. So this gives us insights into how these values were balanced almost 2 centuries ago. You'll note everyone in the painting is a white man. Most are well-dressed. And that speaks volumes about access, inclusion, representation, and accountability. The votes are cast by announcing your preferences out loud. So they're not private, they're not secure. And we can see that bribery and violence are a part of the process. And this speaks to the issue of integrity. Now, we all know that over the course of the next half century or so, there were major changes to American elections to address the problems that this painting illustrates. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution in 1870 ended restrictions on the vote due to race. The 19th Amendment in 1920 extended the right to vote to all women. And these reforms address issues of access and inclusion. The adoption of the secret ballot, especially after the 1884 presidential election, and the introduction of new voting technology like mechanical lever machines helped eliminate fraud and improve election integrity. And these reforms created rules that provided a better balance of values and principles, like the ones we're discussing. But we know that these reforms weren't enough, and that there have been many changes over the decades since. So what does this mean about voting today? How should we think about our current process? Is our current process out of balance? And if so, how should we try to balance it? How do we make sure that people who have the right to vote are able to exercise that right, fulfilling the values of access and inclusion, while also making sure that only those who have the right to participate get to vote, and that each person's vote is counted accurately, fulfilling the value of integrity? And in many ways, this is our greatest challenge, because policies to advance one value, like access, can be interpreted as degrading another, like security or integrity. So as an example, voter identification laws and strengthening voter identification laws might reduce possibilities of voter impersonation and fraud, but they increase barriers to participation that can exclude legitimate voters. Now let's talk about a different example. By a show of hands, and this is not a quiz, no one's going to get graded, but by a show of hands, I just want to gauge your thoughts. How many of you believe that people who are not citizens of the U.S. are legally permitted to vote in elections in the United States? So I see a couple of hands. Turns out many cities, most recently New York City, permit non-citizens who are permanent residents to vote in local elections. They can't vote in federal elections, so not for Congress, not for the president, but they can vote for local offices like school boards. And this is not unique to the United States. Countries as diverse as Chile, Estonia, Israel, South Korea, and many others have similar provisions in their laws. So why should societies allow non-citizens to vote? Or why should they not allow non-citizens to vote? So advocates of non-citizen voting focus on access and inclusion. They also talk about representation and accountability. They argue that policies better reflect the needs of a place when the residents help make that policy. Some advocates have gone so far as to claim that policies are more likely to be discriminatory when voting rights are restricted. Another argument in favor of permitting non-citizen voting is that restricting voting to citizens, especially in places where there are many non-citizens and where the process of naturalization is difficult, is equivalent to a poll tax or voter suppression. Now, opponents of non-citizen voting emphasize representation and accountability, but tend to focus more on security and integrity as well. They emphasize that citizenship is a critical step for exercising certain rights, and that includes voting. And the reason is that citizenship conveys certain responsibilities along with it. Many also argue that non-citizen voting could deter people from becoming citizens if they already have the rights that citizenship conveys. In addition, the complexities of managing multiple voter lists could lead to errors, and that could undermine the integrity of elections. Now, all of these arguments are reasonable, and in many respects, this is the way we should think about discussing elections and reforms. We need to stipulate the values that we prioritize as we're advocating our positions, and think about the ways to find compromise if it's possible. Now, you'll note that I didn't mention how non-citizen voting would affect outcomes, which candidates or which parties would be more likely to win. Some non-citizen communities may be more inclined to vote for Democratic candidates. Some may be more inclined to vote for Republican candidates. Expanding the electorate's a potential opportunity for all candidates to win votes. And assuming that these kinds of opportunities are not really an opportunity, that's a way to lose elections. Parties have to adapt and find ways to compete for votes to be successful. Now, when we're resolving these kinds of issues like non-citizen voting, it's important to recognize different communities may reasonably come to different conclusions as well. These kinds of arguments also don't have a clear winner or loser. You might have listened to some of these arguments and thought that some arguments of the proponents of non-citizen voting were convincing and some of the arguments of the opponents of non-citizen voting were convincing. Ultimately, we have to recognize again that different communities and different places will make different decisions. Now, non-citizen voting is not something we're discussing right now in West Virginia, but we are having robust discussions about election rules. Paige is going to talk about one of those issues and how we can think about election reform in our state from the perspective of values and priorities. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to Paige.
All right. So now let's begin with the discussion of absentee and postal voting. But first, let's make it clear that the choices we make reflect and represent certain values. How does this translation appear to the public? If we draft legislation that emphasizes security, how does this appear that we may be preventing members of the public from exercising their right to vote? If we lessen security measures and loosen those restrictions, does this make the public believe that our elections are at risk for greater fraud or attack? To begin, we're going to outline a brief history of postal voting in the United States, an issue that encompasses these questions very well. So there's a long history of using mail-in or absentee ballots in the United States, first starting in the American Civil War. Originally, only members of the armed services could vote by mail, but this was extended to citizens by Vermont in 1896. By 1938, 42 states allowed absentee ballots for citizens. Currently, all 50 states allow absentee voting to various degrees. In 2/3 of U.S. states, any qualified voter may vote absentee without having to provide an excuse. 5 states, Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Washington, primarily use postal voting in their elections. The intention behind this concept is to simply allow citizens who would not otherwise be able to vote the opportunity to participate in the electoral process. For instance, I actually still have residency in Ohio. I don't live in West Virginia, although because of school, I primarily am here most of the year. Voting by mail allows me to still vote in elections without returning home to my precinct 5 hours away. However, as we have seen in West Virginian history, this inclusivity tool can be corrupted. Back in the 1960s, Mingo County elections were fraught with corruption. One account of this corruption comes from a gentleman named Harry Joe Urban. On October 14, 1968, Urban came to the Mingo County Courthouse. Urban was approached by another man named Jack Webb on the second floor, who then asked Urban if he wanted an absentee ballot. Webb told Urban that he would take care of him, meaning Webb would pay for Urban's vote. Urban then proceeded to visit the circuit clerk's office and voted an absentee ballot after affirming that he thought he might be in the hospital on Election Day. Afterwards, he then walked to the first floor of the courthouse and met Webb, who agreed to pay Urban $5 for his vote. However, when Urban went to Webb's office, Webb took a $5 bill out of a desk in the county courtroom, placed it in his pocket, and gave Urban 3 $1 bills. When approached again 2 days later, Urban received an additional $1 from Webb. This incident was one of many in West Virginia at the time that spurred Senator Rockefeller, then Secretary of State Rockefeller, to conduct sweeping election reform in the state during that era. This story also serves as an example of why West Virginians can be so skeptical of voter fraud at the state and national levels. So despite postal voting's long history in the United States, the concept became controversial again during the 2020 election cycle. Postal votes were cited as invalidating the counts in elections, adding to the rhetoric of widespread election fraud in the United States. Some of these claims were nothing but anecdotal evidence without any factual basis. However, we did see actual evidence of attempted election fraud. One case happened in West Virginia's backyard. This brings us to the case of Thomas Cooper, the Pendleton County mail carrier. Cooper held a U.S. Postal Service contract to deliver mail in Pendleton County. In April of 2020, the Pendleton County clerk received several 2020 primary election COVID-19 mail-in absentee request forms, from which 8 voters had their party ballot requests altered. The county clerk reported the oddity to the West Virginia Secretary of State's office, who then began their own investigation. The investigation found 5 ballot requests had been altered from Democrat to Republican. On the other requests, the party hadn't been changed, but the requests had been altered. Thomas Cooper was found guilty of attempted election fraud in June of 2021. He pled guilty to 1 count of an attempt to defraud residents of West Virginia of a fair election and 1 count of injury to mail. So clearly, we walk this fine line between security and access, effectiveness and inclusion, along with our other values in postal voting. As a social scientist, I feel it is important to return to the technicalities for a second to illustrate this as well. First, let's begin with an illustration of how West Virginia's code stipulates the provisions for postal voting. In West Virginia, excuses are required to request an absentee ballot, but there are many available excuses. This involves being ill or disabled, of advanced age, working during voting hours, or being a student who lives outside of their county. Photo ID is not required to vote, but a voter ID is. The beginning of absentee and postal voting processing is not specified in West Virginian code, and neither is postal voting ballot counting. However, as we can see by this graph here, West Virginia's bordering states have, at times, very different approaches to these same concepts. For instance, an excuse is also required in Kentucky to be allowed to vote by mail or absentee ballot. The acceptable excuses are also very similar to those in West Virginia. By contrast, no excuse is required to vote in Maryland, Ohio, Pennsylvania, or Virginia. In Maryland, postal vote processing begins after the election and ballot counting begins at 8 a.m. the Wednesday after Election Day. In Pennsylvania, both processing and counting begins at 7 a.m. on Election Day. In Virginia, the processing begins as needed and the counting timeline is not specified at all. The verification of ballots between West Virginia and its bordering states also varies. Neither West Virginia or its bordering states requires an ID to verify a ballot. Instead, each state has its own regulations. Kentucky and Ohio utilize signature verification. Maryland only requires signing an oath. Virginia does not require ID, but unlike these other states, requires both a notary and a witness to verify the ballot. What this shows is that while operating under a general federal umbrella, each state has its own measures to ensure security and access, inclusion, and effectiveness, along with our other values. However, these rules can change very quickly within the right windows of opportunity. We saw this phenomenon occur with our very own 2022 regular legislative session just a few weeks ago. Here, we'll cover 3 bills that were originated in the House of Delegates. First, House Bill 2928 would permit registered voters to vote using an absentee ballot by mail in all circumstances. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the West Virginia Secretary of State's office waived the excuse requirement to vote by mail. The bill would keep this waiver permanently while also bringing West Virginia more in line with the 2/3 majority of states by not requiring an excuse to vote. Clearly, this bill aims to expand accessibility and inclusion to voters. Secondly, we have House Bill 4293, which prohibits the mass mailing of absentee ballots by a county clerk or regular citizen. This is a very security-focused piece of legislation. It prohibits the delivery of unsolicited absentee ballot applications to any person who has not explicitly requested one from the county clerk's office. The application to ask for the ballot would be available at the county clerk's office physically and also electronically on the Secretary of State's website. It simply makes it unlawful for any person to mail or deliver an application for an absentee ballot to any voter except when the voter requests it. Finally, we have House Bill 4407, which would require photo identification for mail-in ballots. This is another security-focused piece of legislation. The bill creates a requirement for photo identification when voting by absentee ballot. Absentee ballots returned to the county clerk's office must contain a copy of the voter's photo identification when voting, presenting the ID in person when returning the ballot, or submitting the ballot electronically online. West Virginia currently requires an ID to vote, but there is no photo ID requirement to vote, even when appearing at a polling location in person. Interestingly enough, as we can see, this legislation supersedes the non-photo ID requirement required to vote in person by only applying it to absentee or mail-in ballots. Now, I'm going to pose another question to you all, and I promise it is again not a quiz, but how many of you think that any of this legislation passed this session? All right, I don't see many hands, but none of these bills passed. In fact, 2 were never reported from their first reference committee and their house of origin. Only 1 was communicated to the Senate, where it then died in committee. Think to yourselves about why that may be. And with that in mind, let's think about this generally and return to our question of values. With our discussion in mind, we should all begin to ask ourselves certain questions. What is the right balance? Do we prefer access or security? Do we prefer more accountability or more representation in voting? Do we want more effectiveness and efficiency in how our proceeds go? Or do we want more inclusion of voters? How should we decide what this right balance is? What criteria are most important in determining this balance? And who should decide? Our state governments? Our national legislators? Do the people have enough say in how the process is determined? Furthermore, think beyond the scope of yourself. Think of your neighbors in bordering counties, your neighbors in bordering states. Each individual, no matter where they are or who they are, will have a different balance. We saw this quite clearly in the state statutes that I discussed with you all a few moments ago. This is a very difficult balance to find, and one that will likely be fiercely contested for decades to come. However, for the debate to be productive, these are the questions and values we must consider, both for ourselves and for our neighbors. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, in the political science community, there's a large group of scholars who are investigating questions about election fraud in the US and internationally. And this kind of research takes a number of different forms. Some people look at what they call election forensics. So they look at election results, they try to find anomalies. If they find anomalies, they try to explain those anomalies and to see if the most plausible explanation is fraud. And others look at different types of questions. I think the general conclusion that you'd find in the literature on American politics is that if we're talking about fraud at scale, where it can affect the result of an election, it's really rare. Certain kinds of fraud, like voter impersonation, are also uncommon. And many of the provisions that we have been focusing on are designed to address voter impersonation. Let me just give you an example. And thinking about this from the perspective of values and priorities. So West Virginia, just a few years ago, introduced voter identification requirements. And those voter ID requirements Paige described in great detail. They increase security. There's always a concern when voter identification is introduced that it might affect access. But West Virginia's rules strike a really nice balance. The list of documents that you can use to identify yourself as a voter, it's pretty wide. It's not a photo ID requirement. You can have a bill from a utility that's at your address as an example, something that identifies you as having residence and being able to vote in a particular place. Might it exclude some voters? Sure, it might. Does it affect security? Well, it does help ensure that the people who are coming to the polls are who they say they are. Now, I work the polls in Mon County, and one thing that I noticed, and this also speaks to what Paige said about thinking about not just what values you have, but also your neighbors in the community. I check people in at the polls, and starting in, I think it was 2018, I started asking them for ID. And it was really astonishing to me how many people actually thanked me for asking them for ID. It gave them a sense of confidence in the process. And while I personally, if we think about values, I probably lean more toward access and inclusion when I think about the kinds of rules I'd like to see, I also think that finding something with that kind of balance where we're addressing concerns about security and at the same time addressing concerns about access is kind of a positive way to approach election reform. There have been some individual studies, for example, of states like Oregon, which use only mail-in or postal voting. And there are concerns about opportunities for intimidation of voters or influence over voters in circumstances like that, where you're not going to a polling place, you don't have officials who are overseeing the process, and the potential for a member of a household or people who are in other kind of living communities being influenced in their vote. So those kinds of things have been a concern. I know that the studies in Oregon have not revealed extensive evidence of fraud. As I mentioned, every large election, there's fraud. We can not only see anecdotes of this, but we'll see cases like the one Paige pointed out in West Virginia. The issue is about scale. I've done this international election observation, and I will tell you this, and if you've got questions, I'll be happy to say more about this, but when fraud is large scale, you can't hide it. And I've seen that. So just a couple of comments. The voting machines that are used in the state and generally in the U.S. aren't actually connected online. So when people are voting, there's no security risk when it comes to an online connection there. But especially early on in the development of electronic voting machines, you did have some systems that did not have a paper voting record, which makes the audit process, which we have in West Virginia, many states have some kind of post-election audit process, makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to do. Now in Mon County, there's an electronic system, but essentially the voter's interaction with the system it's like a printer. I mean, you're printing your ballot. You're using an electronic system to print a ballot that you then insert into the ballot box, which counts it, adds to efficiency, but has a paper record so that it can be audited. I think the bigger issue with the voting technology and citizen confidence has a lot to do with transparency. And I think there's often a fear when we don't have physical paper ballots that we are trusting vendors or we're trusting IT experts with something that's so critical to our democracy. And so having, robust audit procedures, and again, West Virginia has audit procedures, so that we can be confident that what the machines have tabulated are an accurate reflection of how people voted. But I do think being mindful of that is critical. Now, just a couple of other reflections. It sounds like the debate that you had about voter ID laws was, if not explicitly about these kinds of values and priorities, at least implicitly about everything we're talking about today. And I think that's really encouraging and promising to hear that the process is focused on that balance of how do we ensure security, how do we ensure integrity, and that the community believes in the process, and at the same time make sure that we can have access. So, your mother or grandmother or my mother or grandmother or someone else's mother or grandmother doesn't go to the polls and is unable to vote or unable to find the right ID or what have you. So I think that's really important. One other comment about voter fraud and paper ballots. So it's interesting that you pointed out, writing on ballots. This has a long tradition in American elections. In the 19th century, before we had an important reform where ballots produced by government were actually introduced. So when that painting, I showed you earlier, when that painting happened, people would vote by announcing their vote, and in some places they would vote by a party ticket. So if you're familiar with the term splitting your ticket, it goes back to this way of voting. So the political parties themselves would print their tickets, their slate of candidates. They might print them in a newspaper, they might distribute them to voters individually, and you as a voter would take that ticket to the polling place and you'd turn it in. Now, people who wanted to perpetrate fraud understood this well. And there were several things they could do. One of which was to, write something on that ballot. Say, I'm going to give you $10, $5, whatever the going rate is for your ballot. But I need to know that you turned in the ballot. So you turn in this ballot, and I've got somebody, if I'm buying your vote, I've got somebody who works in the polling commission. And I can make sure that the right ballots were turned in and then pay you. So these reforms in the late 19th century were a huge problem for people who wanted to commit fraud. When the government is giving you a ballot as you show up to a polling place, you have much less of opportunity to document what your target for fraud is going to do. And when things like the mechanical lever machines were put in place, it made it even harder. Now, the interesting thing is, as technology changes, people who want to perpetrate fraud find new ways to do it. So when I was in Ukraine in 2019, observing their elections, one of the things we were being mindful of was people who had cell phones out in the polling places, especially in the ballot box, and especially if we saw a flash. Because if you were being paid for your vote, how can you prove you voted the right way? Take a picture of your ballot. So 120, 130 years ago, we were able to reduce that problem through new technology, and it's returned. So the people who want to perpetrate problems, there are always new ways to do it, which is why thinking about updating our process is always important to ensure security. And in a similar way, we want to think about populations that haven't been able to access historically and ways to include them in the process. Security is an important value we do have to think about. We are fortunate in the United States that the security risks have been lower here than they have been elsewhere, but it is something we do need to be mindful of, just as we need to be mindful of these other priorities. You raise a number of important issues. Let me talk about kind of two things. You talked about kind of how do we think about competence and training and ability within our election administration, and then the issue of fraud and the potential for fraud in different venues, and how do we really know about scale. I work the polls. And I've worked the polls for a while, and I've observed elections. And so I've been a person with a clipboard standing behind people working the polls, checking on, whether they're doing their job right. And I think in general, the experience I've had, certainly in the US and definitely abroad, is that people are largely committed to doing the job right. But it's complicated. It is complicated. That's why I made the distinction between fraud and malpractice. People do make mistakes. There are sort of two thoughts about this. One is having robust training, having feedback, and having oversight are really important to making sure that the process works well. I would also encourage any of you here or anyone who's watching to consider participating in the process. There's no better way to see how we have dedicated public officials who want to do the job right than to be in those polling places and working on election day. And not everyone can do that. It's a big commitment and so on. But I think it will give you a lot of confidence that the people intend and are trying to do the job right. But they can make mistakes. Yeah, you wanted to weigh in, please.
The most patriotic people I've ever known are poll workers. And by the way, it's the most miserable service from 6 in the morning to 9 o'clock at night or something. But we passed a bill to allow poll workers to work a half day, and I think that should really help, because that's just too much work.
Just need more poll workers now. So we all need to be thinking about volunteering. And I do think that we have an incredible group of people all over the state and all over the country who do volunteer. One of the things that I've tried to do at WVU is we've been starting up a program on elections and campaigns to also try and get young people to participate in this process. The demographics of poll workers tend to be, older people tend to volunteer to serve as poll workers. And I think encouraging more people to work as poll workers can also help populate the polling places if we have shorter shifts, let's say. Now, the question of influence. Absolutely, this is something that people have been concerned about with absentee voting. It's one of the, we're talking about balance, right? So it provides more access, especially people who aren't able to come to the polls. It gives them the right or gives them the ability to exercise their voting rights. It does come with the risk that without oversight, there could be influence over their vote. Now, the people who have done this kind of election forensic research, so they're looking for anomalies in data, obviously they don't know how you voted, how your spouse voted, how people in your household voted. Those are private and secure. By and large, there isn't a lot of evidence of, again, widespread, systematic, and decisive fraud in the U.S. Does it happen? Like I said, yeah, sure. And I'm sure there are people in circumstances like yours who might use their influence on a spouse or on someone that they're caring for and, affect their vote. When I was at another international election, I was in a hospital precinct, and I didn't observe this myself, but one of the other observers came up to me and my partner and told us that they had seen the nursing staff go from bed to bed telling people how they should vote. And that was a violation of the law, but that happened. So whenever you're in that kind of circumstance, there is that risk. And so the more we can do to provide appropriate oversight, but balance that with access, I think we're generally better off, but it doesn't eliminate the possibility of fraud.
And just to kind of piggyback off of that last statement there, moving away from the technicalities of it, and honestly, in my view, returning to a bit of human nature, it's the fact that we're all creatures of our environments as well. So for instance, before coming to college, and even before I started working for Professor Herron, I was probably in this more camp about being more skeptical of the entire electoral process. That was simply my environment at the time. Now that I am involved with research related to this, that I've had the wonderful opportunity to dig through so much state statute and code, I have a greater understanding of how the system works. And of course, as he mentioned, there are instances where things can potentially slip through the cracks, and there are instances where potentially individuals can be influenced. But in my eyes, one of the things that really benefited me, especially as a student, as a citizen, and as a person in general, is just having this greater understanding of how it works. And one of the things that I think would greatly benefit, and we return to this value of transparency in education, is simply having citizens more involved with the process, whether that be physically working at a poll, whether that physically be attending a class that teaches you about these values as such. And I think that is one of the ways that we become more limited in how we view our electoral systems and how we view our outcomes and processes, is simply because we don't understand, because some of the information that we receive comes through the pipes of our environment, whether it be from your family, whether it be from your school, the news, social media. Twitter is a beautiful example of that. But I do think it does return to your environment and how you as a human receive those environmental factors.
And that's why we're here today as well. We mentioned during our presentation that a part of this research project is a little unusual when it comes to a university research project. It's not just about analyzing elections, writing, academic journal articles and speaking to other academics. Paige and I have been really interested in engaging the public in West Virginia on these kinds of questions, because we do think that the more discussion we have, especially when it comes to what we collectively want and emphasizing values and priorities, it can lead to an improvement, at least, in confidence in elections. Now, so this is a right that the states have to run their own elections. And there are guidelines that are national guidelines. There are aspects of our basic laws. The Constitution has certain provisions that all states have to abide by. There are national organizations which have responsibility for certain parts of the process. So the FEC is a national body that especially focuses on issues related to campaign finance. But we're not a centralized hierarchical election system. Some countries have that, where there's a central electoral commission and there are district commissions and there are local commissions, and the rules are determined nationally and they're consistent nationally. So the ballots look the same, the ways that you vote are the same, the offices you vote for are all the same. And that's, the federal system of the US is not designed for that. And there are pros and cons to that. So one of the pros is that it is harder, we were talking about fraud, it is harder to disrupt the US system because at the ground level, the way that we cast and count ballots differs from county to county. So the way that what you would have to do to interfere in a process and systematically affect the outcome would require incredible coordination, knowledge, and ability. And so the decentralized system is really helpful in that regard. It can, though, create problems. So we probably all remember the 2000 election, where the design of a ballot in Florida had a significant impact on the outcome. And that ballot design was put into place by a local official. And if there had been different kind of oversight over the process, maybe that could have been, that bad ballot design could have been headed off before the election happened. So there are these trade-offs. But, the US system certainly has advantages by having elections managed and governed locally. But as we've been talking about all day, trade-offs. We're always talking about trade-offs. I think that for many voters, things like party identification have been a shortcut, and an important shortcut, because ballots can be long. I mean, when I grew up in the state of Michigan, and in the state of Michigan, you vote for the county drain commissioner, among other offices. And it can be hard to find out something about who your preferred candidate is for county drain commissioner. And I've even found that when I've moved to different parts of the country, I've had more or less information, especially about local candidates. So I do think that encouraging our local governments, our local public organizations, like League of Women Voters, to provide information to the community about the platforms of politicians would benefit us all. I will admit, there have been times on ballots, especially since I moved to West Virginia, I always vote. I like to vote in every race, but there have been times I've skipped a race because I just don't know enough about the candidate, and I've looked, and it's very difficult to find information. And so this is something where it's a bigger issue than what we're discussing today. It has to do with local media and what's happened to local media. It has to do with all sorts of other things. But I agree with you that it's important that we have ways to gather information, to study that information, to make an informed vote. And for all of us, if we can press our local officials and our local media to do more of that, I think we'll all be better off. Well, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.